The restaurant was packed that night. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, reflecting golden light onto the wine glasses lined up on the tables. The atmosphere was sophisticated, filled with discreet laughter and hushed murmurs. I shouldn't have been there, not at that moment, not with the heavy thoughts that had been plaguing me for weeks. But something inside me, an almost palpable intuition, guided me to that place, and when my eyes crossed the room, the impact was like a punch in the stomach. There they were. My wife and a man who, until then, had only been an anonymous figure in my deepest nightmares. She was leaning forward, smiling in a way I hadn't seen for years. The sparkle in her eyes, that light, carefree laugh. All that wasn't for me. It was for him. I felt my body freeze for a moment, but my heart felt like it wanted to explode. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the audacity. In the most luxurious restaurant in town, as if there was no chance of being caught. I could hear my blood pounding in my ears as images of our life together flashed through my head like a horror movie, the wedding, the nights we promised to be faithful to each other, the plans for the future. All this now seemed like a cruel joke. I approached their table without knowing exactly what I would do or say. I just knew that I couldn't stand another second of that scene. When they saw me, the shock on her face was impossible to hide. He, on the other hand, tried to keep his composure, but I saw the panic in his eyes. "What are you doing here?" she stammered, as if I were the intruder. My answer came out before I could think. It was visceral, like a wound that finally needed to be exposed. "You're leaving our family today." My voice cut through the air, attracting glances from several tables around. She tried to protest, a mixture of shame and despair taking over her expression. "Please, let's talk." Not here, but I wasn't willing to listen to her. The man, who had remained silent until then, raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "We don't want to cause a scene. Let's settle this calmly." I laughed. A dry, humorless laugh. "Work it out." "Solve what?" "You've destroyed my life, you disgrace." The words came out like a gust, each syllable loaded with the accumulated pain of weeks of mistrust and sleepless nights. All around, people were whispering, some clearly enjoying the drama. But for me, there was nothing but the overwhelming feeling of betrayal. Everything I had built, everything I had fought for, was there, crumbling before my eyes. She tried to touch my arm, a gesture that seemed desperate, as if she could still reach me. "Please listen to me. It's not what it looks like, it's not what it looks like." I interrupted, pulling away from her as if her touch was corrosive. "Then explain it to me. What exactly does it look like? Because, to me, it seems that the woman I swore to love and protect is here, in the most expensive restaurant in town, with another man." The silence that followed was deafening. She lowered her eyes, and I knew at that moment that there were no more excuses that could erase what had been done. The pain gave way to a cold, almost lethal anger. But what devastated me most was not what was happening there, at that table, at that moment. What destroyed me was what would come next, the explanations, the clumsy lies, the secrets that would inevitably be unearthed. I knew that this betrayal was not an isolated act. It was a symptom of something bigger, something I still didn't fully understand. When I left the restaurant that night, it wasn't just the pain of betrayal that I was carrying. It was the feeling that there was something more, something I couldn't yet see, but which was there, between the lines, in the furtive glances and hushed whispers. I needed to know. I needed to understand what was really at stake. And that's what kept me awake that night, the need to find out how far that web of lies went and how far she was willing to go to hide the truth. Welcome to the channel where betrayal is never justified. Here, we tell fictional stories that reveal the devastating impact of infidelity and the consequences it has for everyone involved. Our aim is to show how betrayal can destroy lives, dreams, and relationships. Get ready to dive into a shocking narrative, full of twists and turns and intense emotions. Fasten your seatbelts, because what you're about to hear will move you. Good story. That spring evening, Daniel and Clara's living room seemed to radiate a welcoming warmth. It was a house that, in many ways, reflected their history: a sofa with slight marks from years of use, bookshelves crammed with books and small decorative objects picked up on trips or given as gifts throughout their marriage. The picture hanging on the main wall, a tranquil landscape that Clara had painted years ago, seemed to be the perfect symbol of their relationship. A relationship that, at least in appearance, was solid, full of respect and companionship. Daniel, with his slightly graying hair, was a man with an intense gaze and firm gestures. He worked as an architect and, over the years, had built a career that filled him with pride. He always tried to balance the demands of work with time for Clara and their two teenage children, Lucas and Sophia. Although he was reserved, his silence was never cold. Daniel had a peculiar way of showing love, simple but meaningful gestures. He was the type to notice when Clara was tired, preparing tea for her without saying a word, or changing the light bulb in the bathroom before anyone realized it was about to burn out. Clara, on the other hand, was a woman of vibrant energy. A literature teacher, her classes at the local school were known for being full of life, with heated discussions about poetry and romance. Her passion for words transcended the classroom and also filled the dialogues at home. Clara was the connecting piece, the one who organized family dinners, encouraged the children to talk about their day and kept the house full of conversation and laughter. Her smile was warm, but there had been something in her gaze recently, a kind of distraction that Daniel had yet to understand. Lucas and Sophia were typical teenagers. Lucas, 17, spent a lot of his time in his room, playing guitar and dreaming of the band he vowed to form one day. Sophia, 15, was more sociable, always on video calls with her friends or rehearsing dance moves for the videos she posted online. The relationship between the siblings was marked by constant teasing, but also by a discreet affection, shown in small gestures of complicity. Most of the time, the family's routine was quiet. In the morning, Clara woke up first, made the coffee while Daniel read the newspapers on his tablet. Lucas came down late almost every day, mumbling something about needing more sleep, while Sophia was already ready, full of energy. Conversations at the breakfast table were usually light, with Clara always trying to extract more details about their school lives from her children than they were willing to share. In the evening, the dynamic changed. Daniel used to work late in the makeshift office upstairs, revising projects or answering emails. Clara, after marking exams or planning lessons, would take advantage of the quiet moments to read a good book or watch something on TV. Despite being in the same house, their different schedules created gaps between them, gaps that Clara gradually seemed to notice more intensely than Daniel. On that particular evening, Clara was sitting on the sofa with a book open, but her mind was far away. As Daniel entered the room, he noticed her expression and asked casually, "Thinking about what?" Clara looked up and gave him a smile that seemed more like an automatic reflex than a genuine gesture. "Oh, just at school. One of my students is having trouble understanding the symbolism of a poem, and I'm thinking about how I can help." Daniel accepted the explanation without question, but there was something in her voice that bothered him. He moved closer and kissed her forehead before saying, "You always find a way. That's what you're good at." Clara returned the gesture with a warmer smile, but even so, that brief moment left Daniel with an uneasiness he couldn't explain. As Clara tried to dive back into the book, her thoughts wandered to something she knew she shouldn't be thinking about. It was like a buried secret, a dangerous flame that, at the same time as warming her, terrified her. But she pushed the thought away, focusing on the pages in front of her, as if that could erase what she was feeling. Daniel, for his part, went upstairs to his office, where he spent hours in front of his computer, but without really concentrating on his work. The worry he'd felt when he'd seen Clara so distant that night hung over him. Something in his mind told him that this wasn't just tiredness or the stress of routine. It was deeper, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The next few days followed the same routine. Daniel tried to ignore his growing restlessness, while Clara threw herself into activities to occupy her mind. The conversations between them continued to be kind and polite, but without the warmth of before. Even Lucas and Sophia seemed to notice the change in the air. "Dad, did you and Mom have a fight?" asked Sophia one evening, with that directness that only teenagers can manage. Daniel quickly denied it, but the question kept echoing in his mind. At school, Clara devoted herself to her students even more intensely, as if this could make up for what she was feeling at home. However, even there, her mind often wandered, and she found herself looking at her cell phone with unusual frequency. Messages came in, some answered quickly, others left unanswered for hours, while she struggled with something she couldn't admit even to herself. Daniel, on the other hand, began to notice small changes. Clara was going out more often, mentioning meetings or appointments at school that hadn't seemed so constant before. The perfume she wore seemed stronger, more striking. It wasn't something he could point out directly, but the feeling that something was out of place grew every day. And then, one day, while Clara was at work and the children at school, Daniel was cleaning out his office at home when something caught his eye, a receipt from an expensive restaurant, dated the night Clara had said she was at a meeting with work colleagues. He held the paper for a long time, not knowing what to think. His mind tried to search for rational explanations, but his heart seemed to be crying out for something else. Over the next few days, Daniel began to observe more closely, not out of outright suspicion, but out of a need to understand what was going on. He noticed Clara's distant glances, the smiles that seemed to appear out of nowhere as she looked at her cell phone, and the evasive answers whenever he asked about her day. It was as if she was physically there, but her mind was elsewhere. However, Daniel didn't know that Clara was also fighting her own internal battle. There was a growing weight on her chest, a guilt that she tried to suffocate, but which followed her at all times. At night, while Daniel slept beside her, she would stare at the ceiling, fighting thoughts that she should never have allowed to enter her mind. As the silent tension built up, the house continued to run like a well-oiled machine, but with gears that began to grind. Time seemed to move in slow motion, as if it were setting the scene for something inevitable, something that would change everything forever. The days began to turn into a kind of disconcerting dance for Daniel and Clara. Every movement, every word between them seemed to carry an invisible weight. Clara gradually drifted away, even if she didn't want to, and Daniel, as much as he tried to ignore it, sensed that something was irremediably different. Clara was spending more time away, always justifying it with commitments that seemed non-existent before, long meetings, extra classes, last-minute appointments with colleagues at school. Daniel tried not to question it, but every time she left, a knot tightened in his chest. He told himself it was an exaggeration, that perhaps he was seeing things where there was nothing. But the discomfort persisted, growing like a silent shadow. One evening, while Clara was getting ready to go out again, Daniel watched her from across the room. She was applying her perfume with a care he hadn't seen in ages, straightening her hair in front of the mirror and choosing a dress that looked brand new. He hesitated before asking, trying to keep his voice casual, "Are you going somewhere special?" She answered quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Meeting with the teachers. It's about the literature project. We can discuss it later, it's late." Her smile was hasty, almost forced. He nodded, without questioning further, but felt his stomach turn. Something didn't fit. After Clara left, Daniel stayed in the room for a while, staring into the void. He wanted to believe her, he wanted to trust her as he always had. But the feeling that he was missing out on something, that Clara was drifting further and further away, was overwhelming. He went downstairs to the living room and sat on the sofa with the lights off, trying to understand what was going on. The hours seemed to drag by as he waited for a familiar sound, the key turning in the door, the sound of her footsteps in the hallway. But that night, she returned much later than she had mentioned, entering the house in silence, as if to avoid any encounter. The following days followed this unsettling pattern. Daniel felt that Clara was slipping away from him, like sand running through his fingers. And then something unexpected happened. While fiddling with his cell phone to check his work messages, Daniel saw a notification that shouldn't have been there. It was the shared email account that he and Clara had been using for years, a space they rarely consulted, but which was still connected to their devices. He opened the email by reflex, and the most recent message caught his eye. It was a confirmation of a reservation for two at an expensive restaurant, scheduled for the previous day, the same night Clara said she would be at the meeting. He felt his heart race, his hands grow cold. He read the name of the restaurant, the date, and couldn't help the questions that arose in his mind. Why would Clara be there? And with whom? Over the next few days, Daniel became more attentive. He began to notice Clara's schedule, the details he had previously ignored. She seemed more distracted, more careful with her cell phone, as if she feared something would be discovered. He tried to broach the subject once or twice, but Clara deflected, changed the subject, smiled in a way that looked like a shield against any suspicion. Daniel's unease was slowly turning into a dark certainty. On Friday night, he decided to act. Clara had mentioned another one of those meetings, and Daniel, with a heavy heart, said he had to work late. She nodded, relieved, but he noticed how her expression softened when she heard that he wouldn't be home. When Clara left, he waited a few minutes before taking the car keys and following the same route she had taken. It wasn't long before the vision was confirmed. Clara's car was parked in front of a restaurant. It wasn't just any restaurant, it was the same as the reservation he had seen in the email. Daniel parked a little way away and walked in with firm but hesitant steps. The soft light of the place and the aroma of elaborate dishes almost made him recoil, as if he were invading a space that didn't belong to him. But he had to know. And then he saw them. Clara was sitting at a table in the corner, smiling, leaning forward. In front of her, a confident-looking man with calculated gestures. He was laughing at something Clara had said, and the way her hand rested discreetly on the table, so close to his, made Daniel's blood boil. The sight was almost surreal. It was as if he was seeing someone else in his wife's place. He stopped in the middle of the room, oblivious to the stares he was attracting. Clara noticed his presence almost immediately. Her smile froze on her face, and her expression turned to shock. The man in front of her looked in the same direction, confused. Daniel approached slowly, feeling every fiber of his body tremble, not from fear, but from anger, from humiliation. Clara stood up hastily, dropping her napkin on the floor. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" She tried to remain calm, but her voice failed her. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, then at the man, and finally at the table. Every detail seemed to scream confirmation of what he feared. He took a step forward, but before he could say anything, the man stood up. "Can we talk calmly, sir?" His voice was controlled, almost cold, but the look in his eyes betrayed a palpable fear. "Calmly?" Daniel laughed, but his laugh was dry, empty. He looked at Clara again, and something in his expression made her look away. "You want me to take it easy when my wife is here, with you?" The whole room seemed to have stopped. Clara tried to take Daniel's hand, but he pulled back. "Please, let's go home, we can talk." "Talk? Here's everything I need to know." He turned to the man, staring at him with an intensity that seemed to cut through the air. "Who are you to ask me to calm down? Do you even know what you've destroyed?" The silence in the restaurant was deafening, and Daniel finally took a step back, taking a deep breath as if he needed to remind himself of how the world around him worked. He took one last look at Clara, who looked like she was about to cry, and shook his head. "You've made your choice. Now deal with it." With those words, he left, leaving behind not just a table, but what seemed to be the end of everything he had built. Daniel drove aimlessly for hours, his hands squeezing the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The scene in the restaurant replayed in his mind like a torturous movie, each detail more painful than the last. Clara's face, surprised and full of guilt, the man next to her, the way she was desperately trying to contain the situation. It was all eating away at him, a mixture of anger, humiliation and a pain so intense that he could hardly breathe. He parked the car in front of a deserted park, where the trees swayed gently in the evening breeze. He sat there, staring into the emptiness, trying to reorganize his thoughts. Clara's words echoed in his mind, "It's not what it seems. We can talk." But he knew that, right now, there was no room for excuses or vague explanations. He needed answers. He needed to know the truth, even if it was even crueler than what he had already seen. Hours later, Daniel returned home. Silence filled every corner, heavy as lead. Clara was in the living room, sitting on the sofa with her hands folded in her lap. When she saw him, she got up hurriedly, her eyes red and swollen. "Daniel, please, we need to talk," she began, her voice trembling. He remained standing, keeping his distance. "Then start talking, Clara. Without beating around the bush. I want the truth, the whole truth." She hesitated, taking several deep breaths before facing him. I don't know how to explain it. It was a mistake, something I should never have allowed. I know I hurt you, and, a mistake. Interrupted Daniel, his voice rising a shade. Dinner in an expensive restaurant with a man who clearly isn't just a friend? Is that how you define a mistake? Clara, spare me these generic excuses. I want names, dates, the reason for all this. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, struggling to control her tears. When she spoke again, her voice was low, almost a whisper. His name is Victor. He's the father of one of my students. I met him a few months ago when I had to talk to her parents about her performance at school. Daniel laughed bitterly, shaking his head. So that's how it started? A professional encounter that turned into, what? What is he to you, Clara? Is he more important than our family? No, cried Clara, tears finally streaming down her face. It was never about him being more important. I lost myself, Daniel. I lost myself, who I was. And that's no excuse, but I swear I never wanted things to come to this. And yet they did. Daniel crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on her, hard as stone. Clara, do you realize what you've done? What you've destroyed? I trusted you. I gave you everything, and you. He stopped, swallowing his words, feeling that there was nothing more to say that could express what he was feeling. The silence that followed was unbearable, heavy and full of everything they couldn't put into words. After long minutes, Clara approached him, but he took a step back. Don't try to touch me now, Clara. You say it was a mistake, that you got lost. But I need to know, why? What led you to this? You don't just owe me, you owe our children an explanation. She took another deep breath, trying to pull herself together. It was, the emptiness, Daniel. An emptiness that I didn't know was there until it appeared. It's not your fault, or theirs. I just don't know who I am anymore. And he made me feel something I thought I'd lost in myself. Something you'd lost? Daniel repeated, incredulous. And you think I haven't felt it too? Clara, we've been together for years. Years. And you think I never felt that we were growing apart, that something was wrong? The difference is that I didn't go looking for comfort in someone else's arms. Clara collapsed on the sofa, covering her face with her hands. I made a mistake. I was unforgivably wrong, but I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted you to find out like this. You didn't want me to find out? Daniel let out a heavy sigh, feeling the anger and pain mix into something almost unbearable. So, if I hadn't seen you, would it still go on? Would you still be sneaking around while I thought everything was fine? Clara didn't answer, and that was the confirmation Daniel didn't want but needed to hear. He turned around and walked to the window, trying to control the storm inside him. Looking at the darkness outside, he finally broke the silence. "Clara, I want you to leave the house. Now." She looked up, shocked. "Daniel, please, we can sort this out. We can try, there's no more us to sort out." He turned to face her, his gaze filled with a sadness she had never seen before. "I don't know who you are anymore. I don't know how to look at you without thinking about what I've seen. I need some space. And I think you do too." Clara tried to argue, but the firmness in Daniel's voice made it clear that he wasn't willing to give in. Reluctantly, she went upstairs to get some things, while Daniel remained in the living room, staring into the void, feeling as if the floor had been ripped out from under his feet. When Clara finally left, the house fell into absolute silence. Daniel sat on the sofa, exhausted, with his head in his hands. He knew that this was only the beginning, that there was still much to be confronted, many questions to be answered. But at that moment, all he could feel was the crushing weight of a betrayal that not only hurt, but shattered everything he believed to be true. The next morning, Daniel woke up to the sound of birds outside his window, but the house seemed emptier than ever. The silence, once comforting, was now unbearable. Clara had left the night before, but the marks of her presence were still everywhere, a coat hanging on the chair, a forgotten book on the coffee table, and the faint scent of her that still hung in the air. Everything seemed to shout out her absence and, at the same time, reinforced the weight of what had happened. He got up, wiped his hands across his face and went into the kitchen to make himself a cup of coffee. Every movement seemed mechanical, without purpose. When he sat down at the table, he stared at the cup for a long time, without actually drinking the liquid. His mind kept going over the latest events, searching for meaning where there was none. He felt a mixture of pain, anger, and something he didn't want to admit, longing. His phone vibrated, breaking the silence. It was a message from Lucas, who had been at a friend's house since the previous day. "Hi, Dad. How are you? I'll be here until tomorrow. Let me know if you need anything." Daniel took a while to reply, but wrote, "All right, son. Enjoy." After sending it, he stared at the screen for a few seconds, wondering how he would tell his children about what had happened. They needed to know, but he didn't want them to suffer any more than necessary. Shortly afterwards, the phone rang again, but this time it was Clara. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Daniel," her voice was low, almost a whisper. "I just wanted to see how you were." He sighed deeply, trying to contain the anger that was still bubbling in his chest. "I don't know how to answer that, Clara. You want to know how I am after everything? I'm destroyed. Does that answer your question?" There was a silence on the other end of the line before she continued. "I know I made a mistake. I know that words don't mean anything now, but I need you to know that I never wanted things to end like this." "Ended?" He laughed, but without humor. "You say that as if you weren't the one who started it all. Don't throw those empty words at me, Clara. I don't have the patience for this right now. She paused, trying to find the words. "I just wanted to hear you out, even if it means you telling me how much you hate me." He was silent for a few seconds before replying. "I don't hate you, Clara. That's the problem. Maybe it would be easier if I did. But what I feel now, is a hole. A hole that you dug and filled with lies. I know I don't deserve anything from you, but," she hesitated, her voice wavering. "Can we meet? Not to discuss or justify what I've done, but to talk about the next steps. About the boys, about what we're going to do from now on." Daniel wanted to say no. He wanted to hang up the phone and never hear that voice again which, for so long, had been a source of comfort. But something inside him, perhaps a sense of responsibility, made him give in. "Okay. Where and when?" "Where and when?" She suggested a cafe on the other side of town, a discreet place where they could talk without fear of being interrupted. He agreed, and an hour later he was there, sitting at a table by the window, waiting for her. When Clara arrived, he noticed that she looked more haggard than ever. Her hair was hastily tied up and her face bore the marks of a bad night's sleep. She sat down opposite him, avoiding his direct gaze. For a moment, neither of them said anything, only the sound of cutlery in distant conversations filled the space between them. "I wanted to start by apologizing again," she said, finally breaking the silence. "Clara, I'm not here to listen to apologies. I'm here to sort out what needs to be sorted out. So be direct." She nodded, taking a deep breath. "Right. I think we need to decide how we're going to tell the boys. They'll understand, Daniel. We can't pretend that everything is normal." He squeezed the edge of the table with his fingers, trying to stay calm. "Do you think we should tell them everything? Because, honestly, I don't know how to do it without them hating you." She looked away, biting her lower lip. "I don't want them to hate me, but they have a right to know. I just don't know how to start." Daniel laughed in disbelief. "You don't know how to start? Clara, you started all this on your own. Now you have to find a way to deal with the consequences." She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, there was a determination there that he didn't recognize. "There's something you need to know, Daniel. Something that is going to change the way you see all this. More secrets, Clara. I thought I'd reached my limit. What else can you hide?" She looked straight at him, her gaze steady despite the tears that threatened to fall. "It's not easy to say, but you have to listen. Victor, he's not just the father of a schoolgirl. She stopped, as if the words were too difficult to pronounce. Daniel leaned forward, the anger evident on his face. "Just say it, Clara. What else are you hiding?" She took a deep breath and let it out all at once. "He's someone from your past, Daniel. Someone I didn't know who he was until things were too advanced." His expression turned from anger to confusion. "What are you saying? What do you mean someone from my past?" She swallowed. "He's the man who lost everything because of your project. Do you remember when your office had that dispute with another company, years ago? When there was that merger that left so many people unemployed?" Daniel's eyes widened, the memories coming back like an avalanche. He remembered the time, the pressure to close the deal, the difficult decisions that had to be made. But how did that connect to Victor? And, more importantly, to Clara? Are you telling me that he's connected to this? That he did all this on purpose? Clara nodded, her voice almost breaking. "He knew who you were from the beginning. He knew from the moment we met. And, he used me, Daniel. He used me to get back at you. I didn't know that at first, but, by the time I found out, it was too late." The revelation dropped like a bombshell. Daniel leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of her words. He tried to process what he had just heard, but it all seemed like a blur. Victor had manipulated Clara, and she had allowed it. All of this to get to Daniel in a way he could never have imagined. He looked at her, feeling a mixture of pity and contempt. "So you were the perfect piece in his game. And I'm just the final target." Clara didn't answer, the tears streaming silently down her face. Daniel remained silent for a long time before standing up. "This changes everything, Clara. I don't know if for better or worse, but it does. And now, I need time to figure out what to do with it." Without waiting for an answer, he left the cafe, his mind filled with more questions than answers. Daniel walked aimlessly through the streets, his thoughts swirling like an uncontrolled storm. Clara's words still echoed in his mind, each sentence laden with a truth he had never imagined facing. Victor wasn't just a stranger who had destroyed his marriage, he was a shadow from the past, someone who had directly suffered the consequences of decisions Daniel had made years ago. And now, everything was turned upside down. The night air seemed heavier, as if the world around him also carried the burden of revelation. He thought about Victor's manipulation, but above all about Clara's role in it all. To what extent had she been a victim? To what extent had she been an accomplice? The lines between innocence and guilt were blurring, and he no longer knew who or what to trust. More than ever, he felt lost, crushed by the weight of the betrayal and the impact of his own story catching up with him. He returned home in the middle of the night, the silence of the street reflecting the state of his soul. The smell of the coffee he had prepared hours ago still hung in the kitchen, but now it was cold and bitter, just like his thoughts. Daniel sat at the table, staring into the void, his mind unable to rest. He felt visceral anger towards Victor, but what was eating him up the most was his disappointment with Clara. Not just for the physical betrayal, but for choosing to hide so much from him. The woman he thought he knew was now shrouded in mysteries that he didn't know how to unravel. The next day, Lucas and Sophia returned home. Sophia's usual smile and Lucas's carefree tone brought a brief moment of relief, but soon the tension returned. They quickly realized that something was wrong. During dinner, Sophia finally broke the silence. "Dad, where's Mom? Is she okay?" she asked, her eyes fixed on Daniel's face. He took a deep breath, thinking of the right words to use. "She's away for a while. We need some space. We'll talk about it when the time is right." Lucas looked up from his plate with a skeptical expression. "What happened, Dad? Did you have a fight?" That simple but meaningful question hit Daniel like a blow. He knew he couldn't tell everything, but he didn't want to lie either. "It's complicated. I just need you to trust me for now, okay?" They both nodded, but the discomfort was palpable. Daniel knew that Clara's absence would be difficult for them, but he had no idea how to balance the truth with protecting their children. In the days that followed, Clara tried to get in touch, sending messages and calling, but Daniel ignored most of her attempts. He needed time to process everything before speaking again. However, a message from her caught his attention. "Daniel, we need to talk about Victor. There's something else you need to know." It took him hours to reply, but finally he typed, "Be brief." The reply came almost instantly. "It's not something I can explain in a message. Please find me." Reluctantly, but driven by a need to understand what else was hidden, he agreed. They met in a discreet park, far from anywhere they could be recognized. Clara was different, more downcast than the last time they had met. Her eyes seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. "Thank you for coming," she said hesitantly. Daniel crossed his arms, keeping his distance. "Talk soon, Clara. I'm tired of playing games." She nodded, visibly nervous. "I found out something about Victor after it all started. Something he told me, but now, thinking about it, I think he did it on purpose, to keep me under control." Daniel arched an eyebrow, intrigued but impatient. "And what would that be?" Clara took a deep breath, as if she were about to dive into icy waters. "He told me that, in that merger of companies, it wasn't just his job that you destroyed. It was his marriage too. He believes that it was because of you that his wife left him, and he swore that he would find a way to make you feel what he felt." The revelation hung in the air like a sharp blade, about to fall. Daniel frowned, trying to connect the pieces. "Is he trying to punish me for something that happened years ago, something that wasn't even completely under my control?" Clara nodded. "Yes. And I became his tool. He knew who you were from the start. He knew what it meant for you and for me. But I didn't know, Daniel. I swear I didn't know at first." Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the growing pressure in his head. "And even when you found out, Clara? What kept you going? Fear? Guilt? Or was it something else?" She lowered her head, the tears threatening to fall. "It was all that. And also, shame. I didn't know how to get out of it. I'd crossed so many lines that it seemed impossible to go back." He shook his head, laughing bitterly. "Don't you realize that this just makes everything worse? It's not just a betrayal. It's a conspiracy against me. And you helped. She took a step forward, but he stepped back, raising his hand to stop any attempt to get closer. Don't try to justify anything else. There's no excuse for what you did, Clara. She stopped, staring at him with a mixture of despair and resignation. So what happens now, Daniel? Are we going to carry on living like this, trapped in this cycle of pain and anger? What are we going to do with the children, with everything we've built? Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain he couldn't hide. I don't know, Clara. I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I want to. All I know is that, right now, I need to protect my children from all this. Because, like it or not, they're all that matters now. He turned away, leaving Clara alone in the park, her words still reverberating in his mind. As he walked away, a decision began to form, but he knew that the real test was yet to come. He would have to face Victor, face his own demons and find a way to rebuild his life, whether with Clara or without her. Daniel spent weeks rebuilding the pieces of his life, each day more difficult than the last. The truth that Clara had revealed about Victor, added to the betrayal, created a scar that was impossible to ignore. He focused on his children, trying to be the support Lucas and Sophia needed, even as his own emotional stability seemed to crumble. Little by little, conversations with them began to touch on Clara's absence, and Daniel realized that he could no longer avoid the subject. One quiet evening, while they were gathered in the living room, Sophia finally asked with the frankness that Daniel had always admired in her, "Dad, why are you and Mom really separated? What happened?" Lucas remained silent, but it was clear that he was also waiting for an answer. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "Your mother and I had problems. She made decisions that really hurt our family. But that doesn't mean she doesn't love you. She made mistakes with me, but that doesn't change what you mean to her." Sophia frowned, processing the words. Lucas looked directly at his father, breaking the silence with a more mature voice than Daniel had expected. "Will you ever forgive her?" Daniel was silent for a moment before answering. "Forgiveness isn't so simple, son. But, more importantly, we need to understand that forgiving doesn't always mean going back to the way things were before. I'm trying to find what's best for all of us." The following days brought new challenges. Clara kept trying to make contact, asking to be reunited with her children, but Daniel stood firm in setting clear boundaries. He agreed to allow her to see them, but only under well-defined conditions. He knew that Lucas and Sophia needed their mother, but he also knew that he couldn't force them to live together until everyone was ready. Meanwhile, Victor remained a shadowy presence in Daniel's thoughts. He knew he needed to confront him, not just for what he had done, but to put an end to the story. After days of reflection, he decided to meet him, using the phone Clara had given him to arrange the conversation. Victor accepted the meeting without hesitation, as if he had been waiting for this moment. They met in a discreet café. Victor was relaxed, almost casual, as if he hadn't just destroyed an entire family. Daniel, however, could feel his anger boiling up inside, but he kept his composure. "I know what you did, Victor. I know it wasn't just about Clara. It was about me, about revenge," said Daniel, his voice firm but controlled. Victor smiled a cold, calculated smile. "You're an intelligent man, Daniel. You always have been. I wanted you to feel what I felt, what you took from me. And you think you've succeeded?" Daniel leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Victor's. "Do you think that makes you superior? All you've done is prove that you're as petty as the circumstances that brought us here." Victor didn't reply immediately. For a moment, he seemed to consider Daniel's words, but then returned to his nonchalant tone. "You're right. Maybe I am petty. But now you know what it's like to lose everything." Daniel took a deep breath, trying to contain his anger. "You're wrong. I haven't lost everything. I still have my children, my integrity, and something you'll never have, the ability to move on without being consumed by hatred. He stood up, leaving Victor behind. The confrontation didn't bring the satisfaction Daniel had hoped for, but it gave him something more important, the certainty that he no longer had to carry that weight. Victor could remain stuck in the past, but Daniel was determined to build something new for himself and his children. The following months were marked by changes. Clara, recognizing the extent of her mistakes, agreed to the divorce on amicable terms. She began therapy, trying to understand the reasons behind her choices and seek a path of redemption, not for Daniel, but for herself. Although the meetings with Lucas and Sophia were initially tense, gradually the bonds began to rebuild. She knew she could never erase what she had done, but she was willing to fight to be a present mother. Daniel, for his part, found new strength. He began to prioritize not only his children, but also himself. He returned to running, an activity he had abandoned years ago, and spent more time with friends who, until then, had been sidelined by the hustle and bustle of work and family life. On one of these runs in the park, he met someone unexpected, a woman called Helena, who was walking her dog. The encounter was casual, but over the weeks it became something more. Helena was different from Clara in many ways. There was a lightness about her, an authenticity that Daniel didn't know he needed until he met her. They started going out, leisurely, exploring a connection that was both new and comforting. For the first time in months, Daniel felt hope. Not for the past, but for the future. When Clara heard about Helena, she felt a mixture of sadness and acceptance. She knew she no longer had a place in Daniel's life as a wife, but she was determined to remain a mother and, perhaps, a distant friend. She finally understood that his forgiveness was not something she could demand, but something he would give only if and when he was ready. When Lucas and Sophia saw their father smiling again, they felt a peace they hadn't felt for a long time. They didn't fully understand everything that had happened between their parents, but they knew that, somehow, things were moving toward something better. Daniel, Clara and Victor's story didn't have a perfect ending, but it did have a fair one. They each faced the consequences of their choices and, despite the scars, found ways to move on. The past could never be erased, but the future was a blank page, ready to be filled in. Now that the story is over, let us know what you thought in the comments. Your opinion is very important. And remember, this channel never supports any kind of betrayal. The stories are fictional, but the feelings they evoke are real. Subscribe so you don't miss the next exciting stories. See you next time.